Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Gerard. I'm from Tarawa. This project, in a way, is a corollary, inevitably, of Chris's project. The sort of obviously well-articulated argument about the frame as a place in which people can find home or make home. This is a single-family house for a blended family, and it's a specific house for them. They imagine being on the site for the full duration of their lives, and of course, for the discipline, different questions come up because what does one do now with a single-family house, and what sort of questions does one ask? In the case of this project, we're really, I suppose, thinking about ways of working in and with landscape, and we'll really go through the project discussing situating in landscape, inhabiting landscape, and then, let's say, experiencing or connecting with landscape. The house is located in Middle Harbour, Sydney, north of Sydney Harbour, another inlet. For those of you who are watching the bushfires on TV, you can see why those awful photos exist with houses and just flames running over the back, because of course this is the Sydney landscape and housing condition. In this part of Sydney, because it's so steep, inhabitation's historically been to the top along the ridge roads, and then the landscape falls away and the topography is really steep. Experimentation in housing in Sydney since the 50s with the post-war migration has really happened in these sites because they were cheap, inaccessible, hard to build on, and this is where most of our housing design culture, in a way, has occurred. This house, as you can see by the blue cross, is just at the edge before public land, which sits down below it. It's a heavily forested site, which we'll come back to later in terms of what you're seeing on TV at the moment, and there's a beautiful large squiggly gum at the centre of the site. The first move for the house is really one about the act of movement and the choreography of coming into and around this tree, and the house and the first key move is really about how one was to organise a whole building around this tree really as a single gesture, and I'll come back to these drawings at the end. That's the view from that platform. The house is located in space literally in 3D, where would the inhabitant want to be at a level. The bottom image is really about how this landscape works. It's incredibly tough. These trees are sort of insane. They just can grab onto anything with no dirt apparent and just keep happily growing. And you have this incredibly fractured rock landscape. The escarpment is really steep, virtually vertical, from about 50 metres in front of the house. And so the question was how one could live in this. And in a house that's in a high bushfire zone, the question was how might one live in it, or how might it exist post its life, or post-fire even. Of course, there's a tradition in Australia about these landscapes and being in these places, and the idea of finding home within these places. The top image is Utzon and Otke, I think, on the right. That's where Utzon used to go, particularly when things were getting a bit heavy with the Opera House. At Palm Beach, you would sit there every day on this shelf. Those of you most of you who have been to Canlis know that seat, and that's based on that rock shelf, as was the public domain stuff for the Opera House forecourt. And so, in a way, as with even Utzon's thinking about this, the question was almost how could the project be an abstraction that happened to be a house rather than a thing necessarily filled with lots of stuff. This idea of forming the landscape you can see in the section. The house is this primary platform, and then there's a subterranean part. And of course, as you can see, it's not actually subterranean, but it's designed as if it was, where some ancillary rooms are. And that's the house as it organises itself on site. As I said before, it's a blended family, so there's 5 kids and the 2 adults, and all the kids have grown up bar one. So downstairs is really the entrance, 1 guest bedroom, gym and other ancillary things, and then the top level really unpacks the logic of the house. In Australia, we always sort of grapple inevitably with Glenn's plan, the Mercat plan. Circulation's nearly always at the back, the rooms are always at the front. And of course, it's part of, let's say, our architectural DNA. This flips it and puts the circulation at the front. And of course, the after effect of that is the bedrooms are at either end. It's for the youngest daughter on the left and the parents on the right. And then one then constantly is moving back into space, like back into these dark spaces. And you have to, it's handy for me, the bushfires are on at the moment, because you get a sense of how hostile and hot this place is. So one can have a romantic view about rattling around in dappled light, but actually it's also quite good just to retreat into a dark space and look out. At the back of it is then where the roof folds down, some extra rooms. So the house sits, as I said, bending around this tree. And the form, while it comes from, in a way, this line around the tree, there are other things always happening. We sort of, I suppose, quite a sort of Leverentsian moments, this idea that there's something completely peculiar happening in the form of the building, which when one enters and encounters it, something is revealed about why there's a bulge on the exterior, or why something seems in a way peculiar. So there's almost a question about asking you a question around what's going on inside the house, you might say. So there's a play within a very, in a way, simple diagram of these folds. So this is the entrance sequence at night. You enter, as I said, that bottom level. So there's this almost cave-like bedroom, which you can see on the left. There's a corridor on the right. So it's really tough, really stripped back. The soft things for inhabitation, everything else is really as abstracted and landscape-like as it can be. The other layer, of course, and anyway, it's a bit of a Stephen Hole line, you know, sort of getting the big diagram right and then cutting straight to the detail. And this house is always, if you like, dealing with that. So there's a whole lot of detail work and then nothing in between other than habitation, if you like. So going upstairs, you start to see something which I'll talk about in the end of the talk, which is a series of mirrors and strange windows, which has this sort of Sonian quality of starting to reorient you and open up worlds you didn't know were there or represent other worlds to you. And really that's something about countering the base logic, the brute landscape logic of the house with a detail and a sensuousness, if you like, and multiple ways of experiencing the site. So you see here that sort of deck. You can see the concrete on the left's already starting to colour. It'll basically go stone colour. It's already now. These are a year old, these photographs. And on the right, you can see as the corridor goes along toward the George's bedroom on the far right. So that in addition to the concrete, every time it's inhabited, there's a timber lining. So there's not much happening in this house. It's incredibly passive. There's only floor heating, no artificial cooling, anything else. So really it's only just minor power that happens behind these, but of course they then hold things you need to inhabit, bed lights, bookcases, so on and so on. So the diagram is this concrete escarpment with these timber linings where needed. And the timber linings then give way in the middle of the house to a full timber space before the three smaller bedrooms in the back. And again, always articulated with detail. The bathrooms are always, in a way, these other magical worlds one goes into. This is downstairs where the skylight there comes from effectively 2.5 stories above. So again, there's always this question of trying to connect with, if you like, another world. And I'll probably keep saying that. The house on the one hand is very anchored in a particular place, but it's always trying to connect you with that place or other worlds through the detail. We do that through this work. We sort of call these things instruments. So this is a diagram of the main house, and within the house are a series of instruments that do three main things. You can see here the house in the background and a collection of some of those I'll go through now. So the first, of course, is the primary physical move, the choreography of being on the site, gathering around that tree on the big deck and experiencing that view. The second layer is really about light. As I said before, the skylight, some are like standard skylights, some go down and light comes out sideways, others go all the way down to the bottom, and so light is coming sometimes from mysterious places. And so always connecting you with the outside, even the deepest part of the house at the base, and always connecting you with different ways. The third part of these, attached to these timber pieces, that's really these sort of Sonian layers. So often you'll be in a room and then, as you can see in the top right, a distant part of the landscape's reflected. In a main bathroom, there's this sort of shattered view of the landscape that is, of course, kaleidoscopic, and the standard things one would have in a house to do with one's life and putting things on shelves that are dear to you and so on. So these instruments then create these sort of opportunities. So what on the one hand is this quite monumental concrete escarpment has incredible moments of intimacy. Perhaps unusual for Australian architects, we like playing with the uncanny. It's perhaps because I'm Tasmanian. The sort of darkness that also exists in landscape, and the client who is going to live there their whole life, he always enjoys this gradation from celebration and having parties on the deck to these incredibly powerful psychospatial experiences. So in summary, that's how it comes together, the house and the various instruments, as you can see. And so always when you're outside, even in the twilight, the most darkest moment, you know it's a concrete bunker, something that might surprise you appears. Thank you.
All right, so Gerard, the question, we're sort of sitting around here gossiping, going, where do you find a client with so much time and so much money to do this?
It's actually funny, the house steward, which I should have thanked at the start, because of course it was extremely nice that they found some value in it. They asked a similar question and said, oh, do you do many houses? I said, actually, no, we don't do houses basically at all. We tend to do really cheap community buildings where the terms of the claims for them are community, how community comes together, how you make surplus space, not unlike Chris's project, let's say, before. And in this case, it was this strange brief for a bespoke house that, as often does, comes through a series of friends and connections. And, you know, they're very funny, very good sense of humour. The partner's a very good cook. And the discussion really did start with, we'd really like to reprise a Lautner thing in Sydney, in a way. And that was a sort of... and they came to us because of the geometry we have in our work, and all our work comes through landscape, if that makes sense. So I think that's how they found us, yeah. And they did have a lot of time. So it was designed in 2007, paused for a few years, as many things did, and then 2011 to 18 was the documentation building. As you can see by that concrete, it was built really slow.
So you did the architecture, interior design, and landscape design?
Yeah, so we actually did all the work as in architecture and landscape with the client, and then near the end, Pascal Gomes Manag, interior designer, came on board, friend of the client, and that actually also worked very well and probably helped with that, you know, that particular nuance or fineness of detail that countered the major moves. So the interior is a collaboration, yeah.
I was curious about some of the slides you showed in the beginning of that tree sitting on the rock and just the precarious nature of the site. So were any of the choices of construction material, I mean, is the site as precarious in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, you can see on the right, or the right-hand image off to the right, the fuel load in those things is insane. So in a way, one reason they could get the site was it's almost like the last piece, if that makes sense, a piece where you probably, you know, rolling the dice a little bit in terms of building. So hence, it's a solid concrete thing, and the fire regulations are extreme. So there's a whole project in doing, I think, the first ever certification in Australia for like a commercial fire screen. So basically what happens when the fire comes and you're watching the TV, so you know what this means, we get text messages, go now, go right now. The client presses a red button and runs, basically. That is how, and the house just shuts down, yeah.
So it can withstand the fire? It can withstand the fire?
Yeah, I mean, the fuel loads are so amazing, it's like, it's got the best chance possible, if that makes sense. If this concrete bunker can't, it can't. And you've probably seen photos, you see cars melted to like oil, you know, like so. But yes, theoretically, yes.
So you talked about this in reference to your previous work. It certainly seems recognizable. But you showed boulders, and you showed the cave-like spaces in the coast. And you're also showing a coastline that seems much more curvilinear. And though I can understand that a abstraction of that might be angular, why go so expressively angular in a site that has its own rhythms that seem to be more rounded than angular?
Yeah, no, this is actually a question the House jury also talked about, and it's very hard to explain in photos because actually when you're there, the house isn't there. And and the problem with architecture photography and the representation, the domain we exist in terms of the demands of representation, is it's sort of like this when you're looking at photos. When you're there, it's not really there. The main move is this space. It's a three-part crank around the tree. And that three-part, in a way, you could say compared to a number of other geometries you could use, it's fairly straightforward. What then happens, of course, when you're dealing with concrete is when you make a decision on a soffit and it starts going around a corner, of course, it starts folding a different way, and you end up in these interesting problems one sets for oneself, if that makes sense. And so that's, I think, the thing about the house. I was saying also in regard to Chris's project before, there is this opportunity in these which is so rare where you can just keep experimenting and letting it roll out. But at the same time, yeah, when you're there, the house really disappears. As in, on arrival it's not, but when you're in it, it just recedes and the landscape is there. Because basically you've got one material and that view.
You said something about the way how the family gathers sometimes and goes from, let's say, being secluded in the house or being that you can hide yourself maybe in the house, towards the way how they could meet in the center. How is that working in the relationship to the landscape and also in the relationship to the steps been introduced in the, because it's a kind of stepping stone house.
Yep.
How are all these plateaus operating and working?
It's an interesting question, isn't it, like from a disciplinary point of view as well, because it's their house, so they have a way of living, and there's this tailored, customised jacket, but of course you want it to exist in the discipline as a series of ideas that are not just because the client lived like that. So of course, I suppose every house designer is trying to fuse those things. In this case, it is unusual because they are, as I said, blended family with grown-up kids. So what happens is they almost, you could say, just live. The deck, as you can see on the top right there, is this totally shaded space. The Sydney sun is really high in summer. You then move back into the darkness or come out into the pool and other areas. But the way they lived, because of the cooking activity in relation to that to the kitchen, there really wasn't a project which you often see in Australian projects of this very elaborated MAR or threshold space. That just doesn't exist in a way, in the same way, because they're happy to cook, happy to read, so they sit inside doing that. And of course, as you can see, they also spend days by the pool, as it were. But also the climate is really tough. So at the moment, you know, it's 40 degrees and people can't breathe, so you just shut it down. But you know, hopefully next week it's 25 degrees and it's really nice, so everything is open. But it's, in that sense, it is a bit different. And in the housing, we didn't have there were lots of photos of kids, and I was like, we couldn't talk about how nice the kids like it because they're not there. You know what I mean? It's like a mature, they want to have good parties.
I guess it's more a comment than a question. But you know, you mentioned about architectural photography, and one wonders why it's so bare of occupation. And that seems to be a sort of, you know, we're going almost in this cave-like atmosphere without any people there except for that one girl. And I wonder, some of these questions, you know, why we don't actually photograph buildings like this being occupied.
Yeah, I think probably that's what I said before, and I know this might not be a view everyone agrees with, but of course, so we have a series of photos, particularly for the client, of them enjoying the house. And, you know, we go for dinners, there's lots of those sort of photos. And I suppose I didn't really want to speak in a disciplinary focused event and ask you to believe the clients really liked it because I could get some people to smile in a photo. I want to talk about the project and the architectural consequence of the project, if that makes sense. And so in a way, there's a whole set of photos with people in it. But let's say for this arena, we wanted, you know, they enjoy it, but we wanted to talk about it in other terms.
That's an interesting discussion that people are somehow, and occupation by people are is contrary to the architecture project.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. No, it's more just that I think that, one, there's a trope of putting lots of happy people in the photos. It's proof of concept, if that makes sense. Whereas I think as architects, you can see proof of concept.
And maybe photograph it less emphasizing the angles.
Yeah. Quick question, because as you've seen from all the projects we've seen today, they've all made a very big impact. And a house is a very different thing because it's a private thing, but nevertheless, houses have a big impact. Tell us what the impact of this project, in your opinion, is.
Yeah. No, I think it's another sometimes dilemma in also listening to a lot of the discussions, because of course the architect is always asked to make claims for things they can't claim. You know, so in the past days there are things about housing and how do you insist there's affordable housing, and as you know, you can't insist. You can try your best, but you're not the developer, right? So again, we're probably trying to limit what we can claim, if that makes sense, in a sense of autonomy or discipline, like what is at stake. So in this case, it is a house for some people that have the means to make a nice house on a large piece of land. So all you can do within that context is do the best version of all decisions, if that makes sense. So as I said, the house has no air conditioning. You know, they're replanning the whole site. So in a way, they're just doing as much as they can do within the frame of the project. But one, it doesn't inevitably have the questions at stake. If you're, say, a community project, you might be realising a community because you've done this very cheap thing in a small town.
But its
impact
could be downstream on the building code, the fire code, on the way other people build houses. Has it changed anything, would you say, in terms of how people will build houses in Sydney?
Yeah, I mean, certainly because of how close it is in the bottom left photo, you can particularly see to the fire. There's a lot of architects dealing with this, so we are absolutely not unique. I'd say most of our peers are trying to deal with this. So there was this process we went through, so it's quite practical, to do with actually getting the sort of national scientific body to approve a particular commercial fire shutter in a house, which means that other people can, of course, use that. So there's a whole lot of technical and other outfalls, of course. And it's a continuing project because, as we see with what's happening in Australia now, the codes are almost being revised live.
Thank you very much. Please accept your trophy, and we'll move on to our next category. Some refreshingly frank answers, I thought, here.